thought I would just say a few words about the strengths of our Constitution. It's very important that Australians appreciate, and Australians generally probably don't appreciate, that we have a remarkable Constitution. And a lot of that has to do with our history. It's certainly clear that in 1788, we were fortunate to be colonized by probably the most benign of the imperial powers, because from that very moment that Philip put his feet on this shore, he brought institutions which have been the very basis of Australia. The English language, Judeo-Christian values, constitutional government, because Philip was not a dictator. He had to observe the instructions from the government in London. But especially he brought to Australia the rule of law. The rule of law came first. And I remember my former member, I'm in Wentworth, my former member, Mr. Turnbull, saying in a speech that the penal colony at Port Jackson was a British gulag. A British gulag.
Shame.
And what I then wrote to him was the fact that, to remind him that if you go to the law reports of New South Wales and you go to the very first civil law case in New South Wales, Cable versus Duncan, Cable and Duncan, go to the first case. It is a case brought by two convicts about the loss of valuable property on one of the ships coming to Australia, and it is a case against a ship's captain. And the judge advocate heard the case, heard the evidence of the sailors and others concerned, and then gave a judgment in favour of the two convicts, a very substantial amount of money. This was the very first case, probably in a tent down near Circular Quay, the very first case in New South Wales. This doesn't happen in gulags. In a gulag, you wouldn't dare challenge any of the guards. You certainly wouldn't go to the judge advocate and ask for a summons, and the judge advocate issuing that summons for the arrest of the captain or the holding of the captain, bringing the captain before the court the very next day, and the judge advocate hearing the case, listening to the evidence and coming down in a conclusion in favour of the convicts. That does not happen in gulags. That could only happen under a benign imperial power which was more concerned about propriety and the rule of law, and that is what we had. We very soon after Philip brought those first pillars of our nation to Australia, within a generation, we had the makings of self-government. We didn't have to fight for it. The British had learned from their mistakes in the United States. They already had a form of self-government. They just didn't want to pay tax. They didn't want to free their slaves, and they didn't want. They wanted to move on to the Indian land, and the British were stopping them from. They had to pay some British tax to cover fighting the French. They had to. They wanted to keep their slaves, and the British decision had freed the slaves in England, and that was obviously going to be followed. And finally, they wanted to move beyond the 13 colonies into the Indian land. There was a very bad government in London at the time. There were brilliant people establishing the United States, much better than those in London. Had there been a good government in London, a sensible compromise would have been reached. But the British knew from that you don't fight a colony when it is obviously ready for self-government. By the middle of the 19th century, all of the colonies except Western Australia were autonomous and self-governing. And although the colonies had ignored the wish of the colonial secretary to federate, we then realised it was time to do so towards the end of the 19th century. The interesting thing, which the Republicans forget, is one crucial feature of federation in Australia, something which had not happened anywhere else. And that is it became obvious after the first convention that if you sent the Constitution back to the politicians in the several assemblies, the 6 assemblies, what would they do? They'd disagree with it. They'd all disagree with it. They would never agree on a constitution for Australia. You had the convention writing the constitution, sent it back to each of the colonies. They said, oh no, we're happy with this part of it, we don't want that. It became obvious after some time that we would never federate if we left it to the politicians. We would never federate. We would end up, and we could easily have ended up, like South America, not with the disorder, not with the collapse of government. We could have easily ended up several separate countries, separate independent countries. And there are people in Western Australia who would say hooray, particularly over the GST. But I'm looking there to one of our West Australian friends there, Greg Copley, who's written this marvellous book on sovereignty. But it was becoming obvious that something was needed. There was a conference like this, just a privately organised conference, with smart people like you, and it was moved there by a man, Sir John Quick, later became Sir John Quick. Every school child in Australia should know his name. He should be on all the banknotes. There should be a portrait of him in the foyer. Sir John Quick, he moved the motion at Corowa that in future a convention should not be appointed by the politicians. A convention should be elected by the people of the states, of the colonies as they then were. And perhaps most importantly, after it had developed a constitution and consulted with the people and the politicians in the parliament, after it had done that, the constitution, instead of being sent to the several parliaments of the colonies where the politicians could squabble among one another, that constitution should be sent straight to the people in a series of referendums. Referendums were not well known. There were plebiscites in France, but they were rigged, particularly during the Revolution. But they would do it this way, and that's what happened. That was adopted. The concept of a convention being directly elected, although one state didn't do that, it was essentially directly elected. The concept of the convention or the constitution that they produced being then referred by referendum to the people of the several colonies, that was adopted. A referendum was held. The people of this state, New South Welshmen, I should say to the Victorians and West Australians, South Australians residents, they probably don't realise that New South Welshmen are rather difficult people to deal with, not like you Victorians and South Australians and West Australians. We said no, we didn't give a sufficient vote for a yes case to pass. So it had to be renegotiated through the premiers, and then an amended constitution put up to the people in a second referendum, and that passed in all states. It was a bit slow in Western Australia. But that then meant that the premiers, at a time when there were no jet aeroplanes, there was no internet, the premiers would take that to London and have it pass through the British Parliament, which it was, because the West Australians were slow in putting up their referendum and approving. It was not to take effect until the Queen Victoria, not the present Queen, she is elderly, but not that elderly, until the Queen was satisfied that the West Australians wanted to join. And she signed the proclamation which established the Commonwealth of Australia on the 1st of January 1901. That all took, from the time the convention was established until it was actually in place and approved, that took less than 4 years. The New South Wales government can't lay a tram track down George Street in 4 years. We can't build a dam in 4 years. We had a nation for a continent and a continent for a nation in 4 years. A remarkable achievement. And there's something more about which you should be proud, all Australians should be proud, and should tell Australians that this constitution should not be monkeyed with by delinquent politicians in Canberra. This constitution was arrived at without any war, without any deaths, without any civil disturbance. I don't think anybody got a bloody nose in the debates about the constitution. This must have been the most sophisticated country in the world to achieve that. This is really extraordinary, something extraordinary. And then to have the politicians turn around and try and get that. And then the extraordinary thing too is that we have since then played a significant role for our size in the world, a very significant role in defending the liberty and freedom of other countries and the right of other people to liberty and freedom and the rule of law which we enjoyed in the First World War and the Second World War, for example. And may I compare us with another great country, the United States of America, because the contribution is interesting. The fatalities in the First World War, and we were in it longer, the fatalities in the First World War, as a proportion of the population, were twice that of the United States of America. In the Second World War, we were one of the very few in it from the beginning. Others, like the Soviet Union, were close allies of the Nazis. Others were neutral. We, along with the Canadians and the New Zealanders, the South Africans, and the Indians, we were in it from the very beginning, from the outrage over the entry into Poland, over the breaking of the Munich Agreement by Hitler. An extraordinary thing. And in that war, in that long war, the Second World War, again, proportionately, and no insult to the United States of America, but the comparison is interesting. Our fatalities were 10 times that of the United States of America. So bear that in mind, and all this has been done because we have this constitutional system which guarantees our freedoms and liberties. And as I say, we should not let the politicians monkey around with this and go ahead and develop this outrageous invitation to the Australian people to make a vote of no confidence in the Constitution of Australia.